Hello, SKs. I'm ready to read chapter 14 in Charlotte's Web. It's called Dr. Dorian. The next day was Saturday. Fern stood at the kitchen sink drying the breakfast dishes as her mother washed them. Mrs. Arable worked silently. She hoped Fern would go out and play with other children instead of heading for the Zuckerman's barn to sit and watch those animals again. Charlotte is the best storyteller I ever heard, said Fern, poking her dish towel into the cereal bowl. Fern, said her mother sternly, you must not invent things. You know spiders don't tell stories. Spiders can't talk. Charlotte can, replied Fern. She doesn't talk very loud, but she talks. Well, what kind of story did she tell? Asked Mrs. Arable. Well, began Fern, she told us about a cousin of hers who caught a fish in her web. Don't you think that's fascinating? Fern, dear, how on earth would a fish get in a spider's web? Said Mrs. Arable. You know it couldn't happen. You're making this up. It happened all right, said Fern. Charlotte never fibs. This cousin of hers built a web across a stream, and one day she was hanging around on the web, and a tiny fish leaped into the air and got tangled in the web. The fish was caught by one fin, Mum. Its tail was wildly thrashing and shining in the sun. Can't you just see the web sagging dangerously under the weight of the fish? Well, Charlotte's cousin kept slipping in and dodging out, and she was beaten mercilessly over the head by the wildly thrashing fish, dancing in, dancing out, throwing... Fern, snapped her mother, you stop it. You just stop inventing these wild tales. I'm not inventing, said Fern. I'm just telling you the facts. Well, what finally happened? Asked her mother, whose curiosity got the better of her. Charlotte's cousin won. She wrapped the fish up, and then she ate him when she got good and ready. Spiders have to eat, the same as the rest of us. Yes, I suppose they do, said Mrs. Arable vaguely. And Charlotte has another cousin who's a balloonist. She stands on her head and lets out a lot of line and then gets carried aloft on the wind. Mother, wouldn't you simply love to do that? Yes, I would, come to think of it, replied Mrs. Arable. But Fern, darling, I wish you would play outdoors today instead of going over to Uncle Homer's barn. Why don't you find some of your playmates and do something nice outdoors? You're spending too much time in that barn. It isn't good for you to be alone so much. Alone, said Fern. Alone? My best friends are in the barn cellar. It's a very sociable place. It's not at all lonely. Fern disappeared after a while, walking down the road towards the Zuckermans. Her mother dusted the sitting room, and as she worked she kept thinking about Fern. It didn't seem natural for a little child to be so interested in animals. Finally, Mrs. Arable made up her mind that she would pay a call on old Dr. Dorian and get his advice. She got in the car and drove to his office in the village. Dr. Dorian had a thick beard. He was very glad to see Mrs. Arable and gave her a comfortable chair to sit in. Well, it's about Fern, she explained. She's spending entirely too much time in the Zuckerman's barn. It just doesn't seem normal. She sits on a milk stool in the corner of the barn cellar, right by the pig pen, and just watches animals hour after hour. She just sits and listens. Dr. Dorian leaned back and closed his eyes. Well, how enchanting, he said. It must be a real nice and quiet place down there. Homer's got some sheep, hasn't he? Well, yes, said Mrs. Arable, but it all started with that pig we let Fern raise on a bottle. She calls him Wilbur. Homer bought the pig, and ever since it left our place, Fern has been going to her uncle's to be near it. Well, I've been hearing things about that pig, said Dr. Dorian, opening his eyes. They say he's quite some pig. Have you heard about the words that appeared in the spider's web? Asked Mrs. Arable nervously. I did, replied the doctor. Well, do you understand it? Asked Mrs. Arable. Understand what? Well, do you understand how there could be writing in the spider's web? Oh, no, said Dr. Dorian, I don't understand it. But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place. When the words appeared, everyone said they were a miracle, but nobody pointed out that the web itself is already a miracle. Well, what's miraculous about a spider's web? Said Mrs. Arable. I don't see why you're saying a web is a miracle. It's just a web. Well, did you ever try to spin one? Asked Dr. Dorian. Mrs. Arable shifted uneasily in her chair. No, but I can crochet a doily, and I can knit a sock or a scarf or a hat. Well, sure, said the doctor, but somebody taught you, didn't they? Yes, my mother and father taught me. Well, who taught a spider? A young spider knows how to spin a web without any instructions from anybody at all. Don't you regard that as a miracle? Well, I suppose so, said Mrs. Arable. I never looked at it that way before. Still, I don't understand how those words got into the web. I just don't understand it, and I don't like what I can't understand. Well, I suppose none of us are so comfortable with that, said Dr. Dorian, sighing. I'm a doctor, and doctors are supposed to understand everything, but I don't understand everything, and I don't intend to let it worry me now. Mrs. Arable fidgeted. Fern says the animals talk to each other. Now, Dr. Dorian, you don't believe animals talk? Well, I never heard one say anything, he replied, but that doesn't prove anything. It's quite possible that an animal has spoken civilly to me, and I didn't catch the remark because I wasn't paying proper attention. Children pay better attention than grown-ups. If Fern says the animals in Zuckerman's barn talk, well, I'm quite ready to believe her. Perhaps if people talked less, animals would talk more. People are incessant talkers. I can give you my word on that. Well, I suppose that makes me feel better about Fern, says Mrs. Arable. You don't think I need to worry about her? Does she look well? Asked the doctor. Oh, yes, quite well. And her appetite? Is it good? Absolutely. She's always hungry. Does she sleep well at night? Yes, she does. Well, then, don't worry, said the doctor. Do you think she'll ever start thinking about something besides pigs and sheep and geese and spiders? How old is Fern? She's 8. Well, said Dr. Dorian, I think she's always going to love animals, but I doubt she's going to spend her entire life in Homer Zuckerman's barn cellar. How about other kids? Does she know any? Well, yes. She quite likes that Henry Fussy, Mrs. Arable said brightly. Dr. Dorian closed his eyes again and went into deep thought. Henry Fussy, he wondered. Remarkable. Well, I don't think you have anything to worry about. Let Fern associate with her friends in the barn if she wants to. And I would say offhand that spiders and pigs are fully as interesting as Henry Fussy. And yet I predict that a day will come when even Henry will drop some chance remark that catches Fern's attention. It's amazing how children change from year to year. Now tell me, how's Avery? He asked, opening his eyes wide. Oh, Avery, chuckled Mrs. Arable. Avery's always fine. Of course he gets into poison ivy and gets stung by wasps and bees and brings frogs and snakes home, and he breaks everything he lays his hands on. Yep, Avery's just fine. Good to hear it, said the doctor. Mrs. Arable said goodbye and thanked Dr. Dorian very much for his advice. She felt greatly relieved. Doesn't he remind you a little bit of the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's very nice when adults believe children, isn't it?